11 o'clock, so maybe we should get starting. Welcome everybody to the panel discussion session on social inclusion. I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Stone to take the floor. Dr. Stephen Stone is the Chief of Economics and Trade branch at the Division of Economics, Division of Technology, Industry and Economics at the United Nations Environment Programme. So, Stephen, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jenny. Apparently, I'm fully wired at this point, which is good considering it's about 4:30 in the morning by my biological clock. Well, I'd like to welcome you all here for this morning's session on social inclusion. Hopefully, people will still be coming, and if they make it this far, that's already a good sign because that means they're really committed and they want to be a part of this conversation. And I think it's well worthwhile, frankly, because social inclusion is probably at the heart of what we want to achieve in green growth and green economy. If we don't have social inclusion, we may not have an economy that's really worth having overall. But that will certainly be a topic of discussion today. We would like you all to be involved in this discussion. We'd like you all to come with your thinking caps on, with your energy, with your passion around this issue so that we can really have a fired up conversation around what social inclusion means, what it should mean, how far we've come along the road to building this into our economies over time. And then I would say also the mission and the purpose of the organization that's hosting this event, the Global Green Growth Institute today. I work for the United Nations Environment Programme. I've worked there for about 4.5 years. Before that, I worked in a development bank, like my colleague here to the to my left, for a long number of years. And I can say from my point of view that the environment is something that is pervasive and perhaps something that we all take for granted and critical to our well-being, and probably the unseen input into the economy over time. So I hope, from my personal point of view, is the environment is completely material to our well-being and economic progress. We have an excellent panel here today. The three gentlemen to my left are all deeply committed to this theme through their careers. They're all vast repositories of information and knowledge about social inclusion, development, economic progress. So let me introduce them one by one. This morning, to my first left is the ambassador Niels, you will Pultz, thank you, who I got to know last night. Niels has been with the Foreign Service of Denmark for a number of years. He is now ambassador at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's had a number of very interesting assignments since he first joined, going back to 1977. Right. Which is a long and distinguished career in a country which is frankly remarkable in my point of view. Denmark is probably at the cutting edge of sustainability and has been for some time, probably dating back to the first oil crisis in '73 in some ways. So Niels, very glad to have you with us this morning and looking forward to your contributions. To his left, Anthony, but I think known as Tony Okanoyung. Tony, have I pronounced your last name correctly?
It's acceptable. It takes either a Chinese or a Korean to pronounce it.
Okay, so you can help us with that. Tony has a doctorate in economics. He is currently the senior manager of the Safeguards and Compliance Division at the African Development Bank, which is probably the premier financial organization in the African continent. Does literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of transactions every day supporting development in Africa. So Tony, really looking forward to your contributions as well from probably one of the growth centers of the world. And then to his left, we have Alexander Kolev. Alexander, you have a gracefully much easier last name to pronounce, who is currently with the OECD. He also holds a doctorate in economics from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He heads up the OECD Social Cohesion Unit, so we have a real treasure on our hands in the form of Alexander's presence today. Thanks very much, Alexander. So we're going to kick it off with there's 4 questions that will guide the discussion. I'm going to turn to you every once in a while because I really would like to have your participation in this conversation as we move along. There's 4 framing questions that we have this morning, thanks to Inhi and her team. at 3GI. And the first one starts off with basically what do we mean by social inclusion? And I was asked by one of my colleagues here, who shall remain nameless to protect the innocent, what UNEP means by a green economy. And I just wanted to share that with you first off the bat. Basically, a green economy is like any other economy which produces wealth, value, human well-being, and social equity. But it does so while reducing ecological risks and environmental scarcities at the same time. So rather than producing liabilities and risks that accumulate into the future and eventually drag down growth and human well-being, it reduces them along the way. And that's a key distinction from the economies that we have today. With that sort of long introduction, let me turn first to you, Ambassador, and get your sense. What is social inclusion? Why is it important? And how far have we come in this in time on this issue?
Yeah, I think that Mary Robertson this morning gave an excellent explanation to what it is and why it is important. And yesterday in the 3GI discussions, it was also mentioned by our new chairman, former president of Indonesia, that the world faces three big challenges. One being sustainable growth, get people out of poverty, and to protect our natural resources. It's a very ambitious cocktail for us to take on. And you mentioned, moderator, in your introduction that in my own country, we started a long time ago. We are a small country in the northern part of Europe without natural resources apart from the soil and water. Until 40 years ago, we were totally dependent on imports of energy, coal, oil, gas, whatever. And we had two shocks, as you said. In the 70s, 1970s, which started a new reflection on what that meant to a society like ours. And a way of thinking which would start what we call the green wave, first of all within energy, to start in green energy technologies, green energy solutions, which first of all would, in one way, reduce our dependence on import. It would be able to, if successful, create new technologies which could be a cutting edge in our own industrialized development. And that could perhaps also be part of a cluster which could solve other problems. So that was the start of it, and that went, that was part of a national debate, where we have a strong tradition for social dialogue in our society, starting back more than 100 years ago when we were a poor, underdeveloped country in the northern part of Europe, where, like other European countries, a lot of poor people immigrated to the US, the land of hope, to Canada, to Latin America. So we had to, so to speak, make our own development model, where social inclusion, basic education was two fundamental tools. And that is what is also very strongly behind our development policies, but we have in development strategies that we have launched in developing countries over the last 40, 50 years. And as Mary Robertson said, I think very eloquently, social inclusion has a moral dimension in itself, but it's also something that ensures that what we're trying to do collectively has a much greater chance of success. There are a lot of evidence from various studies that if you don't involve people in development projects in their that is going to if you don't get them with you, there's a much smaller chance of succeeding than if you get them with you to understand and they take ownership. So I think that is a let's say as I understand it, a strong message from the part of the world where I come from, but also in other parts of the world that has huge challenges.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ambassador. Resource poor, socially rich, social dialogue. How do you see it, Tony?
Thanks so very much, Steve. We've been grappling with issues of development for centuries, and I'm not sure we found a solution to it. Like Niels has mentioned, that prior to when we began to think about more sustainable development, there had always been growth. And I know that at that point, growth was largely an economic issue, you know. But then, I think 1992, the Rio meeting, where communities sat down together and said, look, you know what, the present model of growth is not helpful. Let's do sustainable development with the three pillars, the social, the economic, and the environmental. And 20 years after assessing this, we found that we've still made more progress on the axis of economics than we've made on the other axis. We've made more progress on environment than we actually made on the social. So I think the whole idea of the green economy was basically to redirect this model of development to be more inclusive, you know, and then while trying to attain basic efficiency, create resilience, and also deal with issues of sustainability. So having said that, we've always believed that social capital is necessary for you to have physical capital. That physical capital actually goes to where social capital exists. We're trying to bring the discussion back that development is about people. People ought to be at the center of development. We've seen steady progress in the growth of many countries. If you look at the statistics, it tells you that 6 or 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies have been in Africa. But then these are countries that have the highest inequalities also, because the growth also drives inequality. This growth is not inclusive. It doesn't spill down to the masses, to all segments of the society. What it has shown has been the number of African billionaires that have gone up the Forbes list. You know, it's increasing, and not so much the Human Development Index, not so much the number of people we've lifted out of poverty. So it's very important to us that for us to have clear development, that every segment of the society is not just about gender at this point. We've seen what happened in the Arab Spring. We live in Tunisia, and we know what happened. It wasn't because there wasn't infrastructure. There was infrastructure. You know, things were going well. It's a functioning society. But a greater segment of the society, the youths, could not have access to jobs, not even to talk of decent jobs or green jobs. They couldn't have it. But the economy was doing well. So that led to the Arab Spring, and which sprang to so many other countries that are still trying to grapple with that. So for us, it's quite important that for us to have an enduring, sustaining development, that the benefits of development must reach everybody. We do not really deal with issues of human rights in the bank because we are apolitical, but we stress that everybody has a right to development. And that right to development can only come when your developmental model is inclusive.
Thanks so much, Tony. You know, a very insight that just struck me that you said is, you know, how capital flows to where social capital exists, which in a way echoes what Niels had just said. You know, Denmark, very interesting case where perhaps not resource rich, perhaps not capital rich, but a social dialogue that attracted that kind of, and resulted in the capital formation that we see today in a very high-income country. Very interesting. Thank you for that, Tony. Alexander, your take, social inclusion, how far have we come? What's missing? What does it mean?
A lot of questions. Social inclusion is very high in the OECD agenda. It's very much mainstream as part of the policy work that we do for the OECD area, but also as part of the policy dialogue that we have within the OECD Development Center for Developing Countries. And it's very, I think, important also to maybe define a little bit more precisely what we mean by social inclusion. I mean, this is an important concept, but there are different ways of measuring it. I think it refers very much to the level of integration of different people in society. And we know from different experience that because of some characteristics, there are groups actually that may be excluded or that may actually experience some kind of discriminations. These characteristics are well known. It can be connected with age, with health status, with the level of income, with location, with gender, with the level of education, with ethnicity, race, with sexual orientations. I mean, there is a lot of evidence that shows that some groups may actually be excluded. So for us, what is very important is also to be able to measure these forms of social inclusions. There's been actually a lot of pressure on the OECD to better track and monitor progress on those outcomes. As part of the OECD Better Life initiative, for example, there's been actually a lot of requests to move beyond, looking at progress in terms only of GDP, but really to look at the social inclusion aspects and measure different well-being dimensions and make sure actually that we look also at the distributions of well-being with the understanding that there are some groups that may actually be experiencing some deficits in important aspects of it. Now, what are the linkages with the green growth? I think there's obvious linkages that have been actually mentioned this morning during the plenary. But we also understand from a number of studies that, first of all, some particularly vulnerable groups rely heavily on natural livelihoods, and therefore they are very much affected by the extent to which growth will be green or not. This is one important aspect of it. Secondly, we also know that some actually vulnerable people may be disproportionately affected by climate change. And this is why actually we need also to realize that the green growth agenda is very much connected also with a social inclusion agenda.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alexander. So we can look at social inclusion also by what it's not, which is social exclusion. And we see many forms of social exclusion: gender, race, income. What does it mean to you? Are there any parts of the definition that we've missed here? Any elements that we're not hitting in terms of your view of social inclusion? I don't think we necessarily need a microphone. So if you've got something that's missing, if you've got a burning issue, please feel free to raise your hand. Just say who you are and say what you have to say. Any questions? Anything we've missed here on what is social inclusion? We want to be inclusive. Okay, you'll have your chance again. I'll come back to you throughout. So, get your questions together, stockpile them, get your forces together, because we really want this to be interactive and we want you to come in to enrich the whole dialogue. I think this has been a very interesting first round. Something that you mentioned, Tony, and also Alexander, that struck me is when I look at the global panorama today, probably the challenge of social inclusion has never been more acute. There was an Oxfam report that came out in January, and some of you may be familiar with this, which said the top 85 earners in the world have an income which is equivalent to the bottom half of the entire population. So the top 85 earners in the entire world who could fit on a double-decker bus in Piccadilly Circus. I'm not a partisan of London, but
that's on Forbes list, right?
are earning more than $1 trillion, which is more than the income of the bottom half of the population. So when you combine that with the fact that we're in massive technological change at the same time, which happens to be vertically concentrating. A lot of the supply chains become vertical. Capital tends to concentrate, and we heard this also from our dear friend Piketty recently, who produced a book on trends in capital formation. We have a tremendous challenge over time, and I think we're at the forefront. And as Mary Robertson said so eloquently, I think it's not that how did she put it? I think that she quoted Laurent Fabius saying, we're the generation that discovers, and we're also the generation that is responsible for making the right decisions. So that brings us to our second question. And here, I will go first to you, Ambassador. Good practices. Looking around the world, what do we see in terms of good practices for integrating social inclusion into development planning, into financing, into, let's call it, mainstream economics? Ambassador, your thoughts?
Well, we have in Denmark in our development assistance been dealing with a green and inclusive agenda for more than 10 years now. And one element here are the inclusive investment models, which include both local communities in value chains as producers, suppliers, shareholders, employees, and consumers, in order to respond to local and national aspirations. And these business models are actually inclusive and put local groups at the center of the business activity. We have a growing experience of such models and the diverse range of models between investors and local communities, contract farming schemes, joint ventures, management contracts, community leases, and new supply chain relationships. And we have, I think, some interesting examples in different parts of the world, which I would just like to share with you. A few in Uganda and one in Central America. Very different, but also, let's say, given the can really explain the various ways of trying to implement social inclusion and in a successful way. Actually, we're successful both in terms of social inclusiveness as well as business models. One I like very much is one in Uganda called Lightning Uganda, which is about introducing solar light chains in eastern Uganda with a significant increase in access to clean and renewable energy sources. To direct sales by private businesses to create jobs, opportunities for rural youth. Young men and women are trained in maintenance and derive a living from being so-called grassroots solar engineers. And it's a pilot project encompassing around 20,000 rural citizens, farmers in eastern Uganda, and where they have access to affordable light, perhaps one bulb, and light or energy for cooking. And it is a combination of Danish software and creative solutions with Chinese technology and African consumers and businessmen. So, and it's become so successful that the European Union has actually entered that program and tried to expand it to a wider part of Uganda. Another one in Uganda is a program, youth growth, that we support economic growth for low-income and poor farmers, and where also it's an agribusiness and the private sector are primary drivers of sustainable growth. A third one is from Central America, where a business model has been developed with consumers in Europe of sustainable coffee, and involving all the chain back to Central America, and where it was part of the basic demands of our support to the scheme, that it involved local women, cooperatives being created by local women. And it has been so successful that, first of all, the quality of the coffee is high, so it gets international rewards. It has created within 5-6 years 10,000 to 15,000 jobs, sales of additional sales and income of $4 to $6 million US, and a very positive return on investment. And it has really been a way of also involving women as producers in a perhaps very male-dominated culture. So it's I think that's one of the examples that we have, which I like very much personally myself.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Niels. Interesting examples. Private sector linking with what might be traditionally excluded groups, either excluded because they don't have access to energy, which might be the case of Uganda. I think it's one of the countries with the highest inaccess to electricity, perhaps in the world, remaining. But also Central America, where you may have gender exclusion. Very interesting cases. So let me turn to our other panelists and just see if that resonates with your experience as well, what the ambassador has just raised. In other words, is it possible, is it indeed the only way to have the private sector somehow pierce through some of these social taboos and norms to really bring in the excluded into the creation of economic value and prosperity? So let me go first to you, Alexander, and then to you, Tony.
I think it resonates a lot with our experience at the OECD, and we're, for example, measuring social norms and social, how actually social norms affect social inclusions. And what we believe is very important is actually to be able to measure, again, social inclusion, because from our experience, what is not measured usually get out of the radar screen of policymakers. And this is what, at the first place, we think that in terms of, pushing for good practices, one good practice is actually to ensure that governments can actually measure social inclusions and can actually monitor progress over time along these dimensions. Just to give you also another example of why measurement is so important when we discuss these issues of social inclusions, is that, for example, in the context of OECD countries, there has been some impact evaluation that were done to try to assess the efficiency and equity of a number of programs that were developed actually to try to support the inclusion of young vulnerable people in the labor market. And it is actually thanks to the results of impact evaluations that we found out that some programs may be particularly effective. For example, it turns out that in the context of OECD countries, hiring subsidies in the private sectors actually turns out to be one of the most effective programs that can actually support the employment prospect of young people in the labor market. But it is because these programs went through rigorous impact evaluations that actually, the case was made to provide also investments and make sure that, government will feel confident to invest in this type of programs. So there's actually, I think, a number of initiatives that are being developed by governments, by NGOs, by private sectors. Often what we miss is actually to be confident about whether actually this type of programs works well or not. Often we have anecdotal evidence that there are things that may be successful or things that may not be that successful. But I think that with some kind of greater effort to measure the effect and the social impact of these programs on a larger scale, we actually are able to build the confidence in those programs, see what works, what does not work, and ensure that whatever is good practice based on rigorous information can actually be replicated or be extended.
Interesting. So measuring itself is a good practice, measuring social inclusion itself. Tony, you've had some experience in that domain. The remarks of the ambassador, do you have other aspects to add in terms of good practices?
Yeah, thanks. I think before we actually look at some of the good practices, maybe we should also look at some of the impediments to actual having these good practices come up. Because I come from a continent where we're struggling with so many of these things. This is where development is meant to be taking place, a lot of opportunities, but why are we not having this at the scale that we think we should be having, commensurate with the amount of interest from external agencies, donors, monies coming into the continent? A few key points. The first is that planning is not a problem in Africa, my continent. In any African country, we plan. We have a lot of plans. But I think the issue comes into what is the content of that planning, because we are talking about mainstreaming social inclusion. Most people would think that mainstreaming social inclusion is the prerogative of a particular Ministry of Social Development and Culture. And so that is a ministry that's supposed to deal with it, Ministry of Employment, Ministry of Women, Ministry of Youth, and so on. But social inclusion is an economy-wide initiative. So we find ministries planning in silos, doing their initiative in silos without thinking about how they all add up, to creating this inclusiveness that we're talking about. The second is the lack of continuity. We have administrations that have 4 years, and everybody wants to see what they can do in 4 years. These are not things you achieve in 4 years. The electoral cycle determines a lot how we deal with things, not necessarily the long-term planning. And thirdly, technology exists within a culture. We've had several technologies brought in to implement, whether they are soft technologies, hard technologies, without necessarily thinking what is the culture of the people that are supposed to be using these technologies. What do they think about? How would this work within their natural environments? So having said that, there are good practices. For us at the African Development Bank, it's core to what we do. And so we've developed the African Index of Inclusiveness to see how countries are faring, because you talked about measurement. It's important to us to know how countries are faring, then determine what sort of targeted programs can we support in each of these countries. We talk about democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And I think that is what development should be. It should be development for the people, by the people themselves. How much do we take these people into consideration when we are developing plans and programs? Most times, people are not consulted, people are not brought on board. We develop these wonderful ideas and think it will work. It worked in Asia, it worked in Latin America, so why can't it work in Africa? Drop it there, it will work. And most times we've seen it's been a frustration. It doesn't work. We don't have the same cultural identities, experiences like Asia. We saw that in the Green Revolution. That it worked in this region does not mean it will just work the way it is. So I think we need to get more and more into the habit of taking on board the views of the people. I'm not just talking about a bottom-up. It has to be top-down, bottom-up, but everybody just has to get involved. So there are good practices that have been done. One of the ones I keep citing has been the cell phone. Nobody would have imagined that you have such a boost in cell phones in Africa. It's not because the government did anything about it, but people saw the need. And right now, Africans have taken the lead to convert the cell phone not just as a talking device that takes your money, but actually creating wealth out of the cell phone through the money transfers. Like in Nigeria, we have the e-wallet system, where we felt, you know what, we had a lot of corruption in the agriculture industry. Fertilizer was a gold mine. It never got to the consumers and so on. So what our government has done has been to take away the middleman, register the farmers directly, give each of them a cell phone, and then that's the e-wallet. And every farmer is reached directly and given inputs, and he knows how much the markets are, he knows where to get the seedlings, he or she knows where to get the fertilizer. And once the fertilizer is gotten, everybody knows that that farmer has gotten. So it cuts off, it's transformed agriculture in Nigeria completely, because people sat down and thought with the people, with the farmers, what is it that are your constraints? And we realized the constraints of the farmers were they don't have access to inputs, they don't have access to fertilizers, they don't have access to markets. We have an advert, very interesting advert in Nigeria, where some men go to buy cows from a cattle seller and prices them wrongly, and the cattle sellers cover their faces and then seem as if they are conferring and come back. What are they doing? They're checking the market prices somewhere on their cell phone. And then they get back to the guy, and they keep going back in. So when the guy is defeated, they open up and show that they were actually consulting, checking the current market prices for that. So those are the sort of things that we've been able to do because we work directly with the people to identify what their needs are.
Fascinating example, Tony. So culturally appropriate technology as part of the social inclusion. Very interesting example. Let me turn back to our audience now. Any other good practices, examples, or you may also want to hook back to the first question as well? Yes, the lady here.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Brooks. I'm the Regional Director for North and Central Asia and Latin America for GGGI. Very interesting conversation. Thank you very much for this. I've got 2 or 3 different questions, comments, I'm not quite sure. One is just amusing. What is the correlation of green growth? I don't really think I need that one. Green growth and governance systems would be one to sort of facilitate the bottom-up, top-down, integrated, sort of ongoing dialogue that Professor Young was just indicating might be necessary. Second of all, I think that if we cut and slice and dice our communities, our citizenry too much, that we risk, from a grassroots perspective, the same siloing and the same separation that we might see in various ministries, et cetera. And in fact, a stronger approach might be to articulate and identify where there are coalitions of common interests among people, groups, micro and small enterprise, entrepreneurs, et cetera, as a way of building a more consolidated base to have conversations that build broader inclusion, both financially, economically, as well as socially. And then another is a lesson I was brought up with. It was Martin Luther King's exercise in community mobilization, and that was to view citizens as consumers. Very powerful positioning. To look at them as voters, to look at them as labor inputs, to look at them as residents of a particular geographic or administration, because these are positions of power and responsibility and input, rather than looking at groups, again, from a vulnerability standpoint. It doesn't negate the fact that there might be vulnerabilities, but if you position them in a more productive role in any of these, it's a much stronger position. I just wanted to share that.
Thanks very much. Excellent points also. I think that changes our frame somewhat. Instead of looking at the victim, or the poor, the impoverished, the vulnerable, we're also saying, this relates to what you were saying, Tony, is the lower income as a force to reckon with, right? An economic force to reckon with. And I think the digital example that you provided from Nigeria reinforces that. Also, Ambassador, your examples. Other questions, comments from, yes, please.
Sorry, my name is and I work with the Danish government. I have 2 questions. One is for Alexander. I think it's extremely interesting that the OECD is now trying to measure, is now trying to come up with methodologies for actually measuring this. And in that context, I would like to ask you, what do you think of what is being tested around in the world? I'm thinking, for instance, of the government of Bhutan, who have launched this gross national happiness, and they've tried to do it scientifically, helped by McKinsey and others. Well, not to say anything. The other thing is the ILO initiative, not counting jobs, but counting decent jobs, so qualifying what is good employment. And the third one is the standards that are set by the UN Global Compact into how do we include people in jobs? What does that mean? Do we live up to the standards that we have agreed to? That was my first question. Now, Jennifer was allowed 3. So I think the other one is where I want to challenge you a little bit, because Tony, you talked about a problem of the discourse is that ministries are operating in silo. I would argue that so are economists. So when I listen to you 3, you all have degrees in economy. What I miss really in the analysis of Africa, for instance, is a relation between social exclusion and stability. I think what we are increasingly seeing is risks for these African countries, even those who are thriving in terms of economic development, if you look at the most wealthy part, But what is happening in the deprived rural areas is not just poverty. It's you saw Mali, you're seeing it in a lot of other countries. It's uprising, it's a threat to the stability not only of a country but of a whole region. So do we have enough political economy thinking, or are we dominated by economists?
Okay, thank you for that provocative challenge. That's wonderful. I think we'll stop there for the moment. We'll do another round, so if you have further questions, probes, prepare them. We'd like to hear them. And to our panelists, I'd like you to weave in your responses to these very thought-provoking questions in the next round when we actually go to them rather than take them on individually. I just would like to say to our Danish colleague that the world's perhaps top economist, Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF in January, just before Davos, signaled social exclusion and inequality is perhaps the most destabilizing force of our current generation. So, but I'm probably just covering my economist butt with that. Now, moving on to the third question, which I think is a great segue from the. Thank you very much for these two sets of questions, and I do hope our panelists can respond to them as we move along. The third question deals with the strategies and the policies and the institutional approaches that countries can adopt to ensure that social inclusion happens. And I think this goes to the points that you were raising, and also the second intervention from the floor. So with that, I would like to pass the word over to Alexander, who actually will bring some material from his professional experience. And Alexander, if you want to first respond to any of the elements that were just laid out there, that would also be great. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Maybe on the issue that was mentioned, I mean, how to measure well-being and the example of Bhutan, there is actually a lot of very interesting experience from Bhutan that have been, looked out at the OECD in terms of how actually to measure well-being that matters for people. And the way actually, this is part of the OECD Better Life initiatives, where we've actually been looking at experience around the world on how some countries, and Bhutan is, I think, a very interesting example, have been able actually to provide some measures of well-being that goes much beyond GDP. And this is very much actually now reflected in the OECD Better Life initiatives, which actually provide a framework where we measure well-being along different dimensions, not only material well-being, but also subjective well-being, feelings and emotions, which are meant to be very important. And this is part of a very important agenda that we have now. And we're actually really trying to ensure, first of all, that as part of the dialogue that we have with Statistical Office, that many countries will be able actually to produce this type of measures of well-being, first of all, because this is very important. And secondly, that actually policymakers are aware about the usefulness of having these batteries of indicators that actually can be used to measure progress along different dimensions. And this is basically because this is what matters for people. And there's been a lot of, advocacy groups that were actually calling for better measuring, what matters for people. So I think this now is coming very, very high in the OECD policy agenda. And as part of this dimension of well-being, obviously decent work is very important. It's not just about the quantity of jobs, but also the quality of jobs that is being created, which matters. So there have been some efforts to actually make sure that we can measure some more qualitative aspects of the reality of the experience of people. And not only measuring on average, but also looking at the distributions of these measures of well-being. So it's obviously work in progress. There's still a lot of work to be done, both in terms of measurement issues, but also trying also to convince some constituents about the usefulness of having this comprehensive approach in terms of policy making, in terms of the policy making processes. But in terms of the risk also that you have mentioned, we have seen in many countries the rise in inequality, which is now come to a point where it actually threatens development. And this is why actually it's so important to really address these social inclusion issues, not only because we also believe that it is human rights issues, but also because we understand that if countries do not address the problem of social inclusion, it can actually create a lot of instability in countries, and there are many examples that have been, I think, provided so far. Maybe just in terms of looking at the strategies that we could actually put forward to pursue this agenda. I think one thing to say here is that there is no one single model of a cohesive society. So we need to basically look at policies and programs in the specific context of the countries where they're being developed. Having said that, we still believe that there's a number of basic principles that are important. First of all, we believe that policies across sectors must be inclusive, meaning that they need to provide equal opportunities, and this, I think, also respond to some of your queries where you were actually saying that it's important also to look at opportunities and how actually people can contribute. And this is very much in line with this need to look at the inclusiveness of policies from that particular angle. And this is why also we need to make sure that we have some tools to look at not only the efficiency but also the equity of policies across sectors, because otherwise we talk about inclusive policies, but at the end, are we sure that these policies are really inclusive? I think a second important principle that has been mentioned here by the panelists is the need to ensure that policymaking processes are actually participatory. And we know that this is absolutely needed if we want to ensure a strong ownership from key stakeholders that are actually directly impacted and involved by these policies. And without this kind of participatory approaches, we know that implementation will be extremely difficult. And there are many examples around the world that have shown that. So participatory is important. A third important general principle is policy coherence. This is also very important across sectors, but also across different levels of government. And policy coherence is actually something that is extremely important to reconcile the green and the inclusive dimensions of economic and social developments. If we think about policy coherence, this is really a safeguard to ensure that there are no programs that will be developed that will be green, but that will have a negative social impact, or inversely, that may be, socially well done, but with maybe some adverse green consequences. And maybe what I wanted also quickly to share with you is some very interesting collaboration that we had with the government of Vietnam. As you know, Vietnam has been one of the fast-growing economies in the world, and the government actually had some very interesting discussion with the OECD, and they were actually asking us, and they were a bit concerned about the impact of structural transformation on social cohesion in the country. So they've been very successful, but at the same time, they realized actually that there might have been some challenges in terms of social inclusions, and they wanted actually to work with the OECD to try to look at, that we can actually provide some kind of diagnostic of the state of social cohesion. So very quickly, because I know that we have little time, I just wanted to share with you some of the tools that can actually be used to start to address an important question, which is the extent to which growth has been inclusive. And one way of looking at that is to look at the growth incidence curves. This is for Vietnam. These growth incidence curves, for example, look at actually at income growth that take place at different levels of the income distributions. And I think it's a very nice visual presentation of the extent to which growth is inclusive or not. In the case of Vietnam, you see, for example, that income growth, so we looked at the two different time periods, from 2002 to 2008, before the great financial crisis, and then for the period after the crisis. And the dotted line is actually the income growth that took place before the crisis. The continuous line is before the crisis, and the dotted lines is after the crisis. Just to look at the period before the crisis, what do we see by this type of analysis? We see that income growth in Vietnam has been very high for the top rich households, and followed by the middle class, while actually the poorest households had a much lower income growth, meaning that actually growth was unequally distributed in the country, and those who actually benefited least were actually the poorest households in Vietnam. Another, I think, interesting aspect that we looked at is looking at income mobility, because we talk about social inclusions and mobility is very important. We want to see actually whether people can move up the income ladder. This analysis was done in the case of Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam is a very fast-growing country, and what we see is actually that there is basically 20% of households in Vietnam in the recent years that experienced downward mobility in a context where the country was growing fast. So we see that there have been actually both winners and losers in fast-growing Vietnam, that some households actually have experienced a decline in their income. And obviously, the immediate question is to see, but who are those actually households that were not able to benefit from income growth in Vietnam? And we did some analysis. We made a profile of those households actually that did not benefit that much. And we realized actually that these were some particular groups that experienced some particular constraints. And this was very important for us because we were able then to identify some interventions that could actually try to help these particular groups. Another also issue, as we talk about fast-growing countries, which also have problems and challenges in terms of social inclusions, is the issue of social mobility from the perspective of skills mobility. And here, for example, again, in the case of Vietnam, we look at the extent to which people actually who work in low-skill jobs actually have the opportunity to move upward in the skills distributions. And again, I mean, this type of analysis were very useful in the case of Vietnam because we realize actually that in Vietnam, the country has been experiencing a large of structural transformation, but very few people actually were able to move from low-skill jobs to higher skills jobs. And this is obviously a matter of concern because it shows that a large majority of people may be stuck actually in unskilled jobs with little mobility to move upward. And this calls upon also the need to really think about on-the-job training programs that can actually also help address the skills needs of vulnerable workers that will then be able to move up the skills level, which so far was not the case. And last point, very quickly, we've been touching upon the issue of policies that matter for social inclusions. We believe that fiscal policy is actually one that is very important. This morning, the issue of taxes, the right pricing policy was discussed to maybe provide the right incentives for sustainable production patterns, etc. There is also a very important aspect of fiscal policy in terms of the way fiscal policy can be used as a tool to redistribute and to reduce inequality. This is very important in OECD countries where usually fiscal policies are used as a way to reduce inequality. We did this exercise to look at the extent to which fiscal policy in Vietnam were actually contributing to reduce inequality. We found out that very little, and this is something that we find in many other developing countries. For example, in Latin America, we also find that fiscal policy actually play a very little role in terms of redistributions. And we also looked at the design of the fiscal system, trying to do some simulation to see if there were no tax evasions, if the system was fully enforced, how well the tax policy will actually allow to reduce inequality. We actually find again that there will be very little effect on inequality, which basically demonstrated that it was very important to have a dialogue with the governments on the redesign of its fiscal policy. So this is just to give you an example of some tools that can be used to analyze the issue of social inclusion, but as you see, it really cut across a number of sectors, and what we think is very important is really to do some type of analysis that will then help actually to make the case and to see what are the room for maneuver and what can be done in terms of the redesign of policies that may be more inclusive.
Thanks very much, Alexander. Could you keep that last slide up just for a moment? I think it's really helpful. Could you keep the last slide up, please? Really helpful to have some data to go with the discussion. And the last slide in particular, which I found the clearest and the easiest to recognize, because if you look at the Gini before taxes and transfer and the Gini after taxes and transfer, you have quite a remarkable shift. Just looking at the countries on the x-axis, I mean, I'm noticing Denmark on the extreme right-hand side, so I think that, Ambassador, that reflects well on your country. That means that basically your fiscal policies are hard at work. reducing inequality.
Very high and hard at work, yeah.
Right, very, very high and hard at work. Well said. Goes back to the citizen power as well, doesn't it? And then you see sort of the tendency all the way across to the other side, and I think that also speaks volumes about the institutions that are behind the policies and the governance aspects, which may go to the intervention from the lady from Denmark. Sorry, I didn't catch your name the first time around. So very interesting data set there, very interesting set of observations, Alexander. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn to our panelists and get their response. We're talking about institutional approaches, policies, strategies for countries in particular. Let me turn first this time to Tony, get your view from the African Development Bank, and then to the ambassador. Thanks.
Thanks. Maybe let me also try to respond to some of the questions while we address this.
Yes.
There's a very strong correlation between green growth and governance. Without good governance, you cannot drive green growth. A lot of it is because you're going to be, it's more of trying to change the norms, the perceptions, what people are used to. And good governance is what will get you there. We could look at examples in Africa. Take Rwanda, for instance, that came out of genocide, war, and so on, and then decided to lay good governance down. And we're seeing everybody running there. The same with Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi. These are people that have realized that governance is fundamental, because when you want to do anything green growth, it's not just about access, it's about a voice, it's about participation. I lead the bank's work on safeguards, and I can give you several differences. In Tunisia, that was a dictatorship. It's mandatory that our safeguards reports, the environmental and social management plan, whatever we need to do to ensure that projects benefit the intended beneficiaries. When those projects are designed and displayed at the national level, which is the requirement, nobody has ever said anything contrary to what is there. You actually go in there, you clap for the president, and everybody says good things about him and moves. And that's consultation. It's been approved. So it stayed on for 60 days, 120 days, absolutely nothing. Then you move from that to another country where people actually interact with the project, make their views known. When you are designing and implementing those projects, you're going to see a difference. Because the ones that people participated, their voices came in on board, would be better implemented with better benefits than those that the government insisted, this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to do it. But because they have to tick a box, they put it on the table somewhere, and everybody goes there, claps, and then walks away. And at the end of 60 days, the government tells you, see, we told you, it's a good project. There's been no dissentment. So it's quite important. Last night when we were talking, I also raised the issue of an African country that gives out its iron ore deposits, for $250 million to a firm that turns around, cuts it into two, and sells a part for $2.5 billion. That's governance issue. So to address such things, the African Development Bank has set up the African Natural Resource Center to work with African countries to bring better governance into the environmental management issues to ensure that green growth would always be there. Because, think about it. We've always said, look, there was an agricultural revolution. We missed it. Africa missed it. We were not there. That gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. We were not there. Now there is a third revolution going on, the ecological revolution, which we believe Africa should lead because we have what it takes to lead. Without proper environmental governance, we cannot do it. And so it's quite important, and these are the basic ingredients of any green growth or green economy that we want to be dealing with. Then let's still on the issue of what can be done. We've received so much pressure from everybody. Nigeria, you are subsidizing so much fossil fuel, get that fossil fuel subsidy off. our minister woke up one morning and just removed it. And the country almost went, in flames because there was no participation. If there was consultation, it's a good policy to get rid of fossil fuel subsidy. But was there any consultation? No. Was there any participation? No. Even when we knew that we were going to benefit, because those who benefit from the subsidy are not those who need it. It's the rich that actually do get it. The cabals and those on the Forbes list, they benefit from the fossil fuel subsidy, not the poor masses. But it was the poor masses that actually jumped and kicked against it, because to them it wasn't just about removal of, but their voices were not heard. They were not consulted. So these issues are quite important. Then when we talk about green jobs are important, but green jobs are not necessarily decent jobs. There are indecent jobs, even among green jobs. And so our role is to ensure that we have as many people as possible exposed and actually employed in decent green jobs. We are financing the MENA, the North Africa concentrated solar power thing that goes through Morocco, Libya, Algeria, and so on. It's taken a while to get on board. The reason being that the countries in Africa have insisted that the local content must be commensurate, must be high enough. If these machineries are assembled wherever they're assembled, whether they're in Sweden, Veritas, or Denmark, or wherever, assembled and brought in and then installed, what is the job then that will be left for the Africans in those countries other than wash the panels, cut the grass around where the installations are? Those are not decent jobs. So they want to be a part of the manufacturing. If we have facilities to assemble auto vehicles and assemble computer parts and other things, why can't you bring in those things and assemble them within the continent so they can create decent jobs? So these are the sort of things that we're trying to enforce, that the mere fact that it's a green job does not necessarily mean it's decent. We want to enforce decent green jobs on the continent. For us in the African Development Bank, we believe that consultation, participation is absolutely very important. That's my job in the bank, that if there is a job that has gone through, an investment that has gone through in the bank, and there hasn't been sufficient participation, then I'm liable, because I would have had to clear that is done. And that's why from here, I'm actually heading to China. Let me just bring this up. China is Africa's largest development partner. It's putting in so much money compared to what all the MDBs put together and the bilateral partners. So every African leader is indebted to the Chinese. We had the China-Africa Forum, Heads of State Forum, years before the US came up with its first US-Africa Forum or the EU-Africa thing. It's been there for a while. But then we're also having a lot of complaints that in this investments, these wonderful investments we're having, the roads that are lifting people out of poverty, the boreholes, the electricity, the hydro dams, that issues of social governance are not implemented in these projects. And so what my goal is now is, how do we get the Chinese to adopt higher environmental and social standards that will ensure that beyond just building roads, that we've been able to preserve the environment, that the social dimensions of those projects are actually adhered to. Labor laws, international labor laws, the resettlement, and all the other social benefits that should come from those projects, how are they done? So we are not sitting down to bash China, because they're really, really very important to the continent. If the African Development Bank bashes China, the African countries will push you aside, because they know the Chinese gives them 50 times more than what we do. But our role is to ensure that when those projects are long done and gone, that the benefits will remain, and that those projects will bring about social inclusion. Whatever you do, if human beings and their welfare are not center, then we have not really achieved development. Whether it's financial inclusion, it's important that we talk about the people having access to those resources. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tony. And we'll be coming back to you on what the international organizations can do, like the African Development Bank moving forward. But very interesting comment on the third revolution, the ecological revolution, which indeed we heard about from China this morning. China launching its ecological civilization, which is significant, very significant, from the country that's probably grown the most over the past 30 or 40 years, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and yet has an environmental footprint now which is close to catastrophic, both in terms of air quality, soil quality, and water quality. So very interesting set of comments there. Ambassador, I'm turning to you. Reactions from Alexander's presentation and also some of the comments that we got from the floor on the last round.
I just follow up on what Tony said, actually, because I think that he hit the head of the nail, saying that good governance is actually important, extremely important for inclusiveness and to ensure participation. That's why we, in our development work in developing countries, insist on legal frameworks which ensure that citizens are having access to information, are being really on decisions government which influence and affect them. And the latest example of that was that our Minister for Development and Trade just recently decided to increase our support for social dialogue among labor market partners in developing countries. Because this kind of social dialogue is extremely important for what our theme here, social inclusion, is. So I think that Tony's narrative and experience is one of the best examples of why we need social inclusion. Otherwise, it won't work.
Thanks very much. Very interesting set of remarks, and also interesting to know that the money is also following the social dialogue trail, so that this is a hard reality as well as a soft reality. So coming back to you, audience, any comments, questions? Yes, Helen?
Yes, Helen Mountford with the New Climate Economy Project and World Resources Institute. I wanted to actually pick up on a point that sort of marries some comments from Tony and from Alexander here. Which I think is very important. It gets back to that last slide that Alexandra showed, where you're seeing that in a number of countries, they're not using the tax system, the fiscal system, to address inequalities. Now, I think this is a fundamental challenge when we look at some of the green growth policies we're talking about. Tony mentioned fossil fuel subsidy reform. This morning, Ivo de Boer mentioned some of the challenges in implementing carbon pricing and climate policies. We also look at subsidies, underpricing of water, subsidies to agricultural production, and in all of these cases, there are very good reasons, both from a growth perspective and from an environmental perspective, to actually make progress in the reforms. There can also be great benefits from a social perspective. And so Tony mentioned fossil fuel subsidies, water as well. We know that these accrue to those who are rich. They don't accrue primarily to those who are poor. I mean, one standout example for me is from Mexico, where they had the electricity subsidies for irrigation, water pumping, and agriculture, and 80% of those accrue to the 10% richest farmers. So at the same time, you know that the poorer farmers are also going to suffer if you remove the subsidies without doing something to address that. So you need to be able to use the fiscal system and other policies and approaches to actually try and ensure that you don't increase inequalities or increase the problems for the poor, the lower income families and households. So I'm just wondering, getting back to this, how are these discussions being tied together? And how can we actually make progress in using the fiscal system to help redistribute wealth and do this aligned with making progress on the reforms? Because you can't do the reforms without that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Helen. Other questions, comments from the floor? Burning issues, things that are bothering you that we haven't touched on? Yes.
I'm Martina. I'm a graduate student from Yonsei University in Seoul. And I think I don't need that, but still. Professor Nyong, you mentioned the importance of consultation and the dialogue for social inclusion, and I also found it very interesting to hear how the OECD is trying to measure social inclusion, but I still feel that there's like a fundamental paradox in the whole idea of social inclusion, because in determining which groups are excluded, I mean, very often the socially excluded groups are also those who are the least represented, who don't really have a voice, who can't demand social inclusion. So how do you deal with this challenge of determining the groups, their needs, their concerns, and dialoguing with them?
Excellent. Thanks very much for that question. Okay, so we're going to come back to our panelists now. And this time, Tony, you get to kick off. And you may want to take your cue from either of those very good questions. The question that we have from our hosts and is really on the role of international organizations, such as the UN, the OECD, multilateral development banks. What role can they play to promote and foster social inclusion? But you may very well take your cue from either of these two probing questions. Tony, over to you.
Thanks. Let me start with one of the questions. Maybe I've been a sort of a rebel within the continent, because I remember when we were planning for Rio Plus 20, there was a pushback generally from the Africa group. This is a northern agenda. We're still trying to grapple with climate change, and now this has come again. We've not finished with the MDGs. When we just are about to get this green growth, how are we sure something else will not come in just to take us around the circle and achieve nothing? If it is that important, let the West do it. My response, I remember when we were trying to mobilize and get the African heads of states together to look at this, was, if you find a careless driver speeding down a road and your children and your hams were playing, you don't sit down and fold your hands and say, you know what, I'm not the driver, I didn't cause it. If anything happens to my children, I'll hold you responsible. The children will be killed. Our leaders owe us that safety, owe us that basic security, and they need to provide that with state resources. Good fiscal policies will first of all give the confidence that these things are working and we need it. We do not need to depend on foreign resources. Everybody's waiting for the Green Climate Fund to come on board. And it's going to be pittance compared to what the needs of the entire world would be. $10 billion, it's nothing. That's the truth of the matter. We need to get our leaders to know that this is important, and I've always pushed, which I'm sure you're doing in the New Economy Report, that as long as we keep pitching climate change global as an opportunity cost, as a loss, as something that we are spending, not seeing the opportunities that come with it, then we are casting the whole conversation in a very wrong premises. So it's important that those fiscal policies are done. In terms of consultations, yes, it's, like I said, this is for the African Development Bank, this is my job to ensure that as much as possible, we call them project affected communities. When you want to build a road between here and London, there are going to be communities that will be affected by those roads directly and indirectly. We ensure that those people first and foremost are consulted. And when we consult, we do not believe that we will have unanimous consent, but we strive for what we refer to as broad community support, because it's not possible for you to do a road across or a bridge or somewhere and get everybody to say, yes, we want it. There will be somebody, a group of people who just thrive in that disarray, in that disequilibrium, to say we do not want it. But once we have a broad consensus that the majority of the people want it, then we go for it. So it's impractical, it's not realistic to believe that everybody will be consulted and will get their consent before we start. But having said that, green economy has largely been an international agenda driven largely by international organizations, be it the OECD, be it the GGGI, be it the UN agencies, be it the development banks. It's been there. However, there's been a lot of consultations within to take this up. Incidentally, for us, like I tried mentioning at the Rio Plus 20, the whole idea was we will not accept this. This is alien to us. Even if every African died and refused to rot, would only save 3% of global emissions. You know, and we've not decomposed, so there's no CO2, there's nothing. It's only 3%. So why are you pushing the green thing on us? It's not important to us. But the idea was, what model of development do you want to take? You want to take the Chinese model, grow today, clean up tomorrow? Or you want to use the underprivileged position of underdevelopment and do it right the first time? That we think is better to do it right the first time. But then we agreed, what is green? You have olive green, blue green, reddish green, greenish green, all manner of green. So what is green to you? We then said, you know what, you African countries determine what color of green you want. Because nobody can define your green for you. You define what green means to you. If it's olive green you want to pursue, go, it's green. If it's bluish green, go for it, but it has to be green. There has to be green inside it. So, and that's the way we've been able to come out of it. Right now, these international agencies, including the MDBs, are helping African countries now to design specific green growth or green economy strategies that are specific to each of those countries. That of Ethiopia is different from that of Rwanda, and it's going to be different from that of Kenya, because there isn't a single green that cuts through everybody. And so that's what we think we have the leverage of doing, that we can come together. We know what is happening in most other places. It's a global agenda, but we do not pick something from, let me use my ambassador, as good as Denmark is, to say, this is lovely in Denmark, boom, in Rwanda, take it. No, it has to be what is appropriate for Rwanda, and that's what we are developing. The beauty of working with the African Development Bank, by the way, I left UNEP, is that
you can never actually leave.
Actually, the beauty of working with the MDB is that the UN agencies have created very good knowledge platform, research platform, done this assessment, lovely things. But we also feel that beyond doing this, sometimes the African countries get overwhelmed. Where would this money come from? How do we do it? And nothing gives me greater joy than to actually be the one responsible for putting it on the ground to work, and to turn around to say, you know what, it really did work. And that's what the MDBs do. So right now, the MDBs are also contributing to helping countries, not just African countries, countries that need developing countries, to develop their national green growth strategies and identifying projects and programs that can be implemented to achieve those. We largely are implementing entities of most of the global funds, so we have access to that. We can coordinate. We know what basically works. Most of us have been in business for 50 years as development banks, so we can say what works and what hasn't worked. So there's no point in reinventing the wheel. In terms of, for us at the African Development Bank, like we've said, it's been a joy to see African countries get on the crescendo of green growth, including post-conflict countries, including fragile states, jumping on to say, this is good for us who want to do it. We've come a very long way. For those states to now say, you know what, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, where we've come out of a crisis, this is the opportunity for us to do it right, you know. And they come to us, the bank, to say, look, you can give us money to do this, but what should we do? what is it that we can do that will yield good results early. And initially, what most countries thought would happen was that green growth is necessarily driven by cost. But we've been able to let them know that there are very low-hanging fruits, that it's not the cost that you should be looking at first. There's things you can do that won't really cost you that much. And you can set the momentum going. And then once it picks up, other things will then follow. So for us, in dealing with issues of social inclusion, we have safeguards. The safeguards are to ensure that projects that we do, even green projects, have detrimental effects if not properly managed. The so-called green projects have detrimental environmental and social effects that need to be managed to ensure inclusion, and that's what we do. So we have policies, safeguard policies. We talked about skills. We've asked ourselves, if Africa says we need $50 billion a year, $250 billion a year to grow our economy in a very sustainable manner. If that money is dropped on the table today, would this suddenly transform to a green economy? No, because we don't have the skill set, the necessary capacity. So we're working on that. We've developed a very comprehensive human development strategy to be able to implement green growth within the African continent. And then we're dealing with this. Each country will then take it and see what sort of skill sets they need to create, to fit into new jobs, to retrain for, or to transform from certain jobs to other jobs. So those are some of the things that we're doing, apart from the fact that...
Tony, can I stick a pin there? Because we have 5 minutes left in the session, and I want to get to our other panelists, and I want our audience also to be with us through the hunger period. We are up against lunch. But some very interesting points. No single shade of green. The role of skills building, absolutely crucial, because the demand might be there eventually, and the skills not. Let me go first to my colleague from OECD. You're part of a major international organization. You've done groundbreaking work on green growth. How do you see the way forward on social inclusion? Just your quick thoughts, then I'll turn to the ambassador, who can just push us a little bit as three representatives from international organizations, and then I'll throw it out to the audience because you have the right to ask as well. So, Alexander, over to you.
Very quickly to come back on the issue of governance, which I believe is very important at different levels. I mean, we're mentioning the challenge of decent jobs, but I think here, I mean, what we have seen is actually the extent to which increase in labor productivity was actually translated into increase in wages. This is a major issue in many developing countries, and if we're actually believing that, decent wages is important, we also want to see to what extent governance and institutions can actually be boosting the possibility to ensure that when there are actually substantial gains in labor productivity, this can be translated into gains for workers. And this is a major development issue. At the more global level, we still go back to the issue of taxes and development, and the OECD is actually working hard on that issue at the moment, because we see that, and we have to be very clear about that, there's huge tax evasions by multinationals in the world, in both OECD countries and in developing countries as well. And we really have to look at that and work with the private sector and address this issue very frankly and say, forget official development aid. If actually countries were able to renegotiate some of the contracts and reduce the level of tax evasions, this could be a tremendous source of financing for development. And this is an area where actually the OECD is very much working hard, and it needs to be addressed at a global level, because otherwise there is little possibility that one single country can really do something. And another point is, I think a question that was asked about the fact that many excluded people are voiceless, so what are the incentives to make them participating in the public debate? Obviously this is a challenge. I mean, not all excluded people do not have a voice. There are actually people that may be excluded in some dimensions and that may be less voiceless than other groups. But it's true that some groups may be actually voiceless. One entry point that we believe can be actually effective is to measure the cost of exclusion. And when you actually put a price to the cost of exclusions, you can then engage a discussion with government saying that, you know, there are groups maybe that are voiceless, but if you see that, I mean, excluding them has a cost, then, you know, you start to actually raise the interest of, you know, Ministry of Finance that think that actually it can pay off to address the needs of these excluded groups.
Interesting. Thanks very much for that, Alexander. So, Ambassador, I'll turn to you. If you had your wish list or your demand list for international organizations, what would it be? How can they promote social inclusion from your perspective?
Well, I think first of all that they should comply with the human rights-based approach and all the social conventions and agreements this builds on, and that they ensure that participation and social inclusion is considered as a good practice. And we do that when we deal with the UN agencies, development banks, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's important that these institutions see that as a management responsibility, and ensure that the staff involved in the projects and so on, all the way through the streamline, knows it and are aware of it and accept it.
That's tremendously important, and getting that same line of sight and buy-in, I think, is sometimes a challenge. So I want to go out to the audience now. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I want to give you a chance. If you haven't spoken, if there's something that's bothering you that hasn't been said so far, this is your chance to say it. And by the way, this session wraps up the whole session, so also messages both to the international organizations here, like OECD, like the African Development Bank, like UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, but also to 3GI, our hosts for today. Messages that you would like to leave with them, us, about social inclusion. Or questions. Any takers? You must all be very hungry.
I think so.
Yes, the last question here.
I'm sorry, just to occupy the floor, but it seems to me that this is an issue that will become more important as opposed to less important, simply because the proximity of voice and investment is only growing over time, because most projects, will take place at a subnational, even municipal level, and that's just a reality. So the degree of connection, inclusion, and accountability will sink ever closer to communities, and so this confluence of inclusion and good governance is really quite profound.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that. Which takes us back to our first point, I think, that you made, Niels, about how capital goes to where you have social cohesion. Any last burning comments, issues? Yeah? Did you? No? Okay, so we're going to try to wrap up now. I'm going to give our panelists 30 seconds each. We were given a very specific task, which is to come out of here with 3 recommendations globally, but I think we can all sort of hopefully take ownership for them. And I'd like each of you to share with us, the audience, your top recommendation in 30 seconds. So let me start first with you, Alexander, and I'll swing across here and end with the ambassador. Alexander.
Very challenging request, but from our perspective, and if we were to provide one important recommendation, make sure that you measure social inclusion. This is absolutely essential. And for us, this is actually the very basic principles that will allow countries to be held accountable on the basis of the social inclusion agenda.
Thanks very much, Alexander. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, I think to me it would be quite important that policies are being made with the people that would benefit from those policies. It would be important not to have a parachute type of policy on any given people, no matter how brilliant it's come from. We've seen that a lot on the African continent. I'm not singling out McKinsey, but they are very popular on the African continent, advising countries and developing policies. So let's work more together.
Work together. Okay, thanks very much, Tony, and thanks for all your comments and contributions today. Ambassador, your top recommendation?
Well, I already mentioned it in last intervention, but I can repeat it, that social inclusion is something that needs to be taken by the leadership. There needs strong leadership to ensure that. It's recommendable to build alliances with social society, like Green Economy Coalition, make sure that the competences in the relations are there.
Absolutely. So building the trust, the social fabric, which I think was also pointed out by some of our comments from the floor. So it's been a very interesting conversation, fairly wide-reaching, probably one-dimensional in terms of gender, but thank you for balancing that from the floor. Thank you also for that great question from the postgraduate perspective. I think you have to keep asking the questions, because if a good question is worth a million statements and will provoke the thought that is needed to actually face this challenge. And I think going back to the very provocative statement by Mary Robinson this morning, we are the generation that is facing some of the toughest decisions that have come the Earth's way in a long time. And so we're living at a very exciting time. I'd like to thank the three panelists for joining us today and for you for participating in this conversation.